Time to check in with Dr. Joe Schwarcz, our weekly checkup for you, if you will, and a couple of stories in the news. He, of course, is director of the McGill Office for Science and Society. Look, it's funny, Joe. I know the first topic today is about coffee and its effect on memory and cognition. I have this sort of running battle, if you will, with my wife with respect to coffee, right? Because there are some people saying coffee is terrible for you. Some people saying, no, coffee is actually good for you. And I know it's not unique to coffee when we have these sorts of discussions. So let's start with that as far as coffee itself goes. And I know oftentimes you'll say this, Joe, everything is about, if you want to call it that, moderation, right? If you're not drinking 10 cups of coffee a day, every week, that's one thing. But to have those, occasional cups of coffee or even a couple of cups a day, nothing wrong with that is still pretty much where we're at?
Right. And an exclamation point there on, 2, 3, or maybe 4 cups of coffee a day being beneficial. More than that is very, very questionable. So much has been written and said about coffee consumption because obviously it's one of the most popular beverages in the world. So there is concern about, whether it does us good or does us harm. There has not been all that much done on the relationship of coffee and cognition. But interestingly, there are some new studies that have just come to light. Coffee, as you know, is a very, very complex concoction. It's made of over 1,000 compounds, so, attributing benefits to any specific one is really not possible. But coffee contains a number of compounds in the polyphenol family. And we have, pretty good information about these compounds because they're found widely in fruits and vegetables having some benefit. They fall into the antioxidant category. So anyway, in this rather new study, which extracted data from the UK Biobank database. Now, this is a database that has been accumulated since about 2006 and has compiled information about the dietary patterns, the lifestyle, and health status of 500,000 participants. And these people routinely filled out dietary and health questionnaires, and they also provided blood, urine, and saliva samples, and they took various tests that assess abstract reasoning and memory and logical thinking. So from this data bank, they selected about 8,000 people who were not impaired in any way in terms of cognition, but were over the age of 60. And, it is at that time that you start to have some memory loss, which is totally normal. So as one would expect, there was a decline in test scores of cognitions as the years passed, but the decline was steepest in the high coffee consumption group. It seems that moderate consumption slowed the decline. So, as you suggested earlier, what we have here is another example of the time-tested cornerstone of toxicology that dose matters. Moderate consumption is fine. More than 4 cups a day probably is not. Now, this is not the only study that has addressed this issue. There was another study that just came out a couple of days ago, and this was reported by researchers at Harvard. And they followed over 6,000 subjects over the age of 50, and they followed them for 7 years and found that moderate coffee consumption, again, we're talking, 2 to 4 cups, associated with a 28% lower risk of dementia. So that's the kind of thing that we like to see. But then, of course, you also ask the question, is there any possible harm in consuming that amount of coffee? And the evidence is that there isn't. We would know if there were because there are enough people around the world consuming enough coffee. Now, in rare cases, some people have a special sensitivity to caffeine, and will cause undue alertness, restlessness, and in some cases even a boost in blood pressure. But that's rare. And of course, what do you say to those people? You say, okay, well, if it doesn't agree with you, just don't drink the coffee. Right. But there are people who are taking matters into their own hands, and they're making what has been called bulletproof coffee.
Yeah.
And this was the brainchild of Dave Asprey. He's an entrepreneur with no background in nutrition. And he likes the high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet that he says can cause weight loss and reduce inflammation, but there's no supporting evidence for this. And he calls himself a biohacker. Now, biohackers are people who experiment with different substances to see if they can enhance their own biology and live longer and healthier. This character takes over 100 dietary supplements a day. He sleeps in a hyperbaric oxygen chamber, and he says he's going to live to 180. Well, I think it's a pretty safe bet that he's not going to do that. But he hit upon this idea of bulletproof coffee after drinking yak butter tea in Tibet. This made him feel better, and he says it boosted his IQ by 20 points, although I don't know of any evidence. So he promotes this idea that people should be drinking the bulletproof coffee to get smarter because of what is mixed in there. And what is mixed in there is some medium-chain fatty acids from coconut oil or palm oil and some butter from grass-fed cows. Now, there's no evidence that this does anything, but you can't completely rule it out because it turns out that, these medium-chain fatty acids from coconut oil or from palm oil actually have been studied. And the brain requires glucose as a source of energy, but there are alternate sources of energy that it can use, and these are the so-called ketones. I think we probably talked about these before when we were talking about ketogenic diets. And these can be used by the brain as a source of fuel when it cannot metabolize glucose properly, and that is what happens in Alzheimer's disease. And there have been some studies in people with Alzheimer's at very early stage of disease who were given these medium-chain fatty acids on a regular basis and improved cognition. So I can't completely rule out that this bulletproof coffee, is useless, although I would think so because the amount of fatty acids in there is not very much. But who knows? Then finally, there's also something called cognition coffee. And this is sold by a company called the Mushroom Farm, PHARM. And they sell a variety of supplements made from wild mushrooms. And they claim that this cognition coffee, which has ground up lion's mane and chaga mushroom in it, improves cognition. But they are not forthcoming with any kind of evidence. So this is where we stand with the story of cognition and coffee. I think 2 to 4 cups a day is likely to be beneficial, not likely to be harmful. And it may help ward off dementia.
And good luck. Try putting some butter in your coffee, see how that tastes for a while, and see how that goes. Joe, thank you. Appreciate it.
Okay, thanks, Aaron.